actually the US economy, I think globally it's about $20 trillion a year, a bit more, which is essentially the size of the European economy. So it has a real cost, and leaders know this. If you listen to Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Anderson, who's now trying to execute a big turnaround at Bayer in Germany, the founders of Google, they'll all tell you it's a curse. They'll tell you they don't know how to kind of escape it. Mark Zuckerberg, I guess about a year or so ago, kind of bemoaning what Meta had become, he said, you don't want an organization where it's just managers managing the people who are doing the work. That's not a good idea. In fact, I would argue, I think it's literally impossible. I've never yet seen an organization with 8 or 9 management layers that is nimble and innovative.
Hi, I'm Nick Hague, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Gary Hamel has been a professor at London Business School for more than 30 years and has been hailed by the Wall Street Journal as the world's most influential business thinker. We live in a world of head-snapping change, and so we must rethink the very foundations of how we lead, manage, and organise our businesses. Gary's written many landmark books, but his latest release is an update on his 2020 book, Humanocracy. This podcast is about how to create an organisation that's fit for the future and fit for human beings. And in order to do this, we need to rid the world of fossilised bureaucratic structures. Gary's going to tell us how to do this. And remember, as always, if you like what you hear, or if you're watching on our YouTube channel, then please do subscribe. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Gary.
Well, a pleasure to be here, Nick.
Well, it really is an honour to have you on the podcast today. Well, Fortune magazine has called you the world's leading expert on business strategy. The FT, Financial Times, has referred to you as management innovator without peer. Were you always interested in business at a young age?
Well, I guess so, because I did an undergraduate business degree and then an MBA and then a PhD. So yes, I think, business is a powerful force for good. It shapes our lives. It drives innovation across the economy. So yes, I thought, business and organizations in general intrigued me. How do people come together and do things collectively that they could never do alone? That was a very interesting topic to me. And when I was in the PhD program at the University of Michigan, this is a long time ago, but it was a time that at that time, Japanese competitors were kind of pummeling the American car industry.
Yeah.
And I also saw, therefore, close up, the consequences of bad management. When you don't have foresight, when you don't have the courage to act, when you're stuck in the past, the consequences are profound, and not only for the leaders, in fact, least of all for the leaders, mostly for everybody else. So I realized that, there's a deep cost when organizations are not run well, and of course, extraordinary gains when they are run well. So yes, that was an interest from, I guess, a fairly young age.
Yeah. Well, I think I first heard you talk at Excel. I think it was London 2009, that event. And, since then I've followed your work very closely. There's 2 people that stood out on stage. I can't remember the event that day, but Dan Pink was one of them. And he was on the podcast just a few weeks ago, and yourself, and both have shaped my business career. So it's definitely a bucket list box I can tick to say I've interviewed you both. But before we get into your new, your updated book, Humanocracy, I'd like to just start with looking back on your early working career, because you began work as a hospital administrator doing the homework. And did your time as this administrator open your eyes to what it's really like working under this massive organizational bureaucracy for such a large, complex business?
It was a very large hospital, yes. And that was kind of my first job after an MBA. I was there for a year. And I realized that, no offense to people who are working in that industry or in jobs like that, but it wasn't very interesting. It was kind of the same meetings, the same kind of routine week after week. Now, obviously, healthcare is an immensely complex industry, and it is, I think, very fascinating. But for me in that role, it just didn't kind of ring my bell. And so I realized my dad had been a professor, a teacher. I always loved to teach. I thought that's what I wanted to do. So I thought I'd probably have a higher value added if I went down that route than if I spent the next 20 years climbing the ladder in a large organization. Having said that, I've spent countless hours in and around managers all over the world. So I guess I've got to live that career vicariously, but that was probably the right way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's a segue into your book, Humanocracy. Copy on the shelf behind me. I loved it. Your work has always challenged conventional wisdom about management. And although you've written other books, I think this book that I've read anyway takes your thinking to another level. And you talk about how to rid the world of bureaucracy. So let's start with, when you first wrote Humanocracy in 2020. What inspired you to write the book in the first instance?
Well, Nick, I had, spent a lot of time through the years, as I said, working in and around large organizations. I'd led a lot of big change projects in companies that all of your listeners would know. Um, uh, and as I did that, I realized that all of these companies, irrespective of culture or industry or geography, all of them suffered from similar disabilities. They were kind of congenitally timid. It was very hard for them to commit to goals that they couldn't plan for. Um, uh, Change was typically, behind the curve, often belated, and often required a change in leadership to revector the organization. They weren't very innovative. They often surrendered the future to kind of upstarts and young companies, and they were soulless places to work. I mean, if you looked at the data, people just weren't that excited to be at work. And when you see a same set of disabilities or maladies again and again, you realize it's not about one leader or one company or a strategy. There's something much deeper going on. And so, I said, well, what do all these companies have in common? Well, what they all have in common is they are still run by the structures and principles of industrial bureaucracy, which is about 150 years old or so. And so then I said, okay, well, what problem was that invented to solve? It's just another technology, and like any technology, it was a product of its time, and it was aimed at solving a particular problem. And when you go back and you read people like Max Weber and others writing at the time, it was essentially invented to solve the problem of efficiency at scale.
Mm.
So, we had all these wonderful scientific inventions at the time in the Industrial Revolution, but to make them accessible to people, you had to produce them again and again with decreasing costs, with super reliability. And that meant essentially turning human beings into machines. And you wanted them to be as reliable as the machines that they served. And you go, well, that was an amazing accomplishment. It powered the modern economy. But like every technology, it has limits, and maybe it at some point reaches its sell by date. And so the question that kind of I started to think about is, all right, this is bureaucracy has made an enormous contribution. It allows us to it gives us consistency, control, it allows coordination. But how do you buy those benefits duty free? Is there a way of doing that? Can we avoid, the apathy, the rigidity, the inertia, and so on that comes with that? And so that kind of led me down that path of starting to look for organizations that I think had figured out how to escape the kind of bureaucratic curse, but still ran with great discipline and focus and alignment. So
Yeah.
that was, yeah, and just recognizing, Nick, how much the world has changed since, if you go back 150 years, the average employee was illiterate; they could not read or write. Administrative skills were very rare. Being a manager 100 or 120 years ago was like being a data scientist or geneticist today. It was that category of employee didn't even exist. We created business schools to train those kinds of folks. Information was very expensive to move, and the easiest way of doing that was to have a pyramid with multiple layers, and people report up, and therefore only the people at the top had the full picture and could make the big decisions. And you realize that none of that is true anymore. And yet we're still kind of hostage to that model where power trickles down and big leaders appoint little leaders. And most of our systems and processes are there to exert control and minimize risk. And then you also realize we're in a world where efficiency at scale is still important. There's no room in a global economy for inefficiency, but it's only one advantage among many, right? I need entrepreneurship at scale, and I need a speed at scale, and I need boldness at scale. And that old management model was just inimical to those, probably next generation capabilities.
Yeah, yeah, and I've sat both sides of the fence actually, because seeing it firsthand in my business career, started and set up and ran an agency for 25 years, an independent agency, and so being part of a corporate culture after that for 5 years. And as this independent agency, we were fundamentally, we were entrepreneurs, we were human-centered, adaptable to change as you need to be, making decisions quickly. And especially with marketing, did we want to design it was a market research agency. So did we want to design a new framework and talk about that in market and very quickly send that out there? We were very, fleet of foot, whereas then part of a corporate structure, it really did feel very restrictive, layers of hierarchy, rigid procedures, more meetings after meetings, moving at a snail's pace. It really did seem like this night and day comparison. And I think you talk in the book, don't you, about bureaucracy and the way that it costs the global economy some $3 trillion annually in lost productivity.
That's actually the U.S. economy. I think globally it's about $20 trillion a year, a bit more, which is essentially the size of the European economy. So it has a real cost, and leaders know this. If you listen to Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Anderson, who's now trying to execute a big turnaround at Bayer in Germany, the founders of Google, they'll all tell you it's a curse. They'll tell you, they don't know how to kind of escape it. Mark Zuckerberg, I guess about a year or so ago, kind of bemoaning what Meta had become. He said, you don't want an organization where it's just managers managing managers managing managers managing the people who are doing the work. And it's like, yeah, no, that's not a good idea. In fact, I would argue, I think it's literally impossible. I've never yet seen an organization with 8 or 9 management layers that is nimble and innovative. I mean, it's just, and we can get into why that is, but yeah, we can no longer afford the bureaucratic tax. Maybe once we could, when change was a little bit better behaved, when the world wasn't so turbulent, but I don't think any longer. And you see this in public sector institutions as well, right? If you look at the NHS in Britain, I look at the military in the US for all their amazing competence. We now have twice as many kind of administrators per soldier as we had 20 years ago. And there are more generals in the U.S. military who are running staff functions than leading, battlefield units. Well, how did that happen? So, yeah, it's we have to have the courage to change that, which won't be easy, but it's time.
Yeah. And then, so that was 2020 when you first published Humanocracy, and then obviously COVID came along, different happenings in the workplace around remote work, technological changes with AI coming out and this need for agility. So you've updated this new edition. How does this new updated edition differ then to the listeners?
Well, it probably has about 40% new content. So it has a ton of new cases. For example, we go deep into the transformation at Roche, one of the largest companies in the world in the pharmaceutical industry, and an amazing change that you would have thought almost impossible, where you take out half the number of layers, you embed all the corporate staffers inside patient-facing units and so on. So, one of the challenges of making this switch is very few leaders have ever seen it done. And so they don't have much confidence that it's actually possible. So we wanted to bring in new cases like that. Barnes & Noble, a bookseller that was on the ropes, competing with Amazon, complete turnaround by pushing authority down and turning on the folks running local stores across the country, led by a great British bookseller, Mr. Daunt. You can find his wonderful bookshop, I think, in Marylebone High Street. So we wanted to bring a lot of new cases that were kind of very current. And we wanted to put a lot of new data in that kind of looked at what was changing and the fact that large institutions around the world are becoming more ossified. And we have some, I think, very provocative data on that. So yeah, we just thought it was time to, update it, expand it. And to be frank, Nick, in the 4 or 5 year interval there, companies have not made much progress. I mean, I think we are still quite a ways ahead of where the average company is. And so I could have written a new book, but I'd rather help companies make this switch than give them another challenge to think about.
Yeah. Well, I had the original book and I bought this, and like you say, it's a lot bigger. It's a lot chunkier, and there's a whole lot more in there. Lots of other case studies, and it is a fascinating book. I mean, the transformative impact that it can make is massive. But the examples that you've just talked about, Bayer, for example, that have embraced this new way of working. Before I read the original book and this one, I thought, well, maybe Gary, we talk about new startups for digital or software sector, that be incorporating this new way of working. But to my surprise, a lot of them were like, Bayer or Roche or more established manufacturing companies, and like Nucor and Haier, who embrace the change, aren't they?
I think, as you were saying earlier, Nick, young companies definitely, in fact, let me say this. I think the real advantage of many startups is less that they have this original business idea. Often they do, but those ideas are not as rare as you might think. The real advantage they have when compared to incumbents is they're fast, they're lean, they're fearless, they're and but they lose that as they grow.
Yeah.
Because the recipe for how do you manage complexity and scale is you add more layers, you add more policy, you add more staffers. And so decision cycles get longer. People have less freedom to change as they see the world around them changing. And so this seems, we've often assumed that this is just inevitable. It's just like aging. It just has to happen. And so
Yeah.
the reason, I didn't focus on young companies particularly is, well, they have that lean, fast advantage, but almost all of them lose it, as we were talking about Meta a minute ago. So the real test is not, can I run a company with 50 or 100 or even a few hundred people in this way? The test is, can I run a company with 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 employees in this way? And historically, the answer was no. But I think we have enough compelling examples that, like, it may be hard, but you can't tell me it's impossible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're going to get into the detail with some of my questions. I think just picking on those two examples that I mentioned there, Nucor, I think a lot of it comes through with this putting they particularly put expertise and autonomy within the frontline workers, didn't they, to drive the progress there, and I think a lot of incentives that we can talk about, the pay that they had a base pay rate that was under the industry average, 75%, but all these incentives to sweat the assets to increase the bonus that were paid to teams as opposed to individuals. These were all little levers that they were pulling to drive towards this change that they put within their company, which is steel mills. This is a true blue collar, dirty manufacturing business.
Well, I would say that one of the themes of the book is that we are wasting colossal sums of human imagination and initiative. And you see that when you look at the data. I'm friends with the folks at Gallup, and I follow their data closely. So when you see that roughly only 20% of people around the world are engaged in their work, and that's lower if you just look at frontline employees. When you see that only 1 in 5 employees believes their ideas matter at work, uh, and only 1 in 10 feel free to experiment or try new things, we have a problem, right?
Yeah.
We look at right now where we have declining productivity growth across the world, and with huge implications for our ability to fund our social priorities and income inequality. I think the only way out of that is we got to turn on all that unused intellectual capacity. So that's very much the theme of the book. And I'm also quite worried about the fact that over the last several decades, capitalism has worked way better for the few than the many. So in the United States, we've created over the last 20 or so years $130 trillion of stock market values. Almost all of that has gone to the top 50%, and most of them to the top 1 or 2%. And therefore, you end up with a lot of political turmoil in our countries because average people are simply not getting ahead. And I think part of the solution to that is we have to give them the skills, the upside, the freedom to be entrepreneurs, to be problem solvers within their organizations, and then reward them when they're doing it. And I think you get into almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, or if you assume people on the front lines are only doers, they're not thinkers. If you take away their freedom, if you haven't trained them to think like business people, then yes, they're not going to contribute very much. And then you can easily say, well, that's because they're frontline people and they're not, they don't have the credentials or the university education. I think it's a terrible shame that has happened. And I think part of, again, a kind of a sub theme in the book is we have to give everybody a stake in capitalism. Not about giving everybody a universal guaranteed income or making sure that everyone gets unionized. I think those may be solutions, but I think a much better thing is you actually turn on the problem solving people skills of people and you reward them for doing that. And there's an interesting analogy, and then I'll take a breath here, but an interesting analogy that I see. If you look at what's happened in social media right now on YouTube or in the podcasting world, but right now on YouTube, there are more than 60 million channels.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to kind of young people, the creators, I tell them, guess what, guys? You are no more creative than your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, all the way back. You are not special. You have nothing. Nothing is, you don't have any mental equipment they didn't have. What you have is two things. You have low cost tools of creation with your smartphone and digital editing and so on. So it's very easy for you to create. First time in human history, you could do that. Secondly, you have platforms with very few gatekeepers where you can post and share. And so you go, so that alone says there's this unbelievably deep reservoir of human creativity and ingenuity out there. And then you look at the average company and say, how much of that are you tapping? Have
Yeah.
you trained people to think like business innovators? Do you make it easy for them to get small amounts of money and time to try new things? Do you hold leaders accountable for mentoring those people? Do you give them a financial stake in what they're creating? The answer is no, no, no. And you go like, okay, well, this isn't because it's impossible. It's because you haven't chosen to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there's various different principles of humanocracy. You taught the reader through in the book, and one thing that stood out to me in the book is this emphasis of decentralization. We've talked about it already, reducing managerial layers, greater autonomy to the workforce, so that decisions can be made there and then. Could you share how organizations can start to transition towards this model without creating chaos? Because we've talked about the fact that bureaucracy has been around for 150 years or whatever. So how can we start to take these small steps into making these changes?
So let me maybe give one or two examples to start with, because at one level, yes, when you basically say we are going to have to fundamentally change the way large or even medium-sized institutions are run, right? We need fewer layers. We need power to be pushed down. We need organizations that are more lateral than they are vertical. We need coordination to happen through collaboration rather than centralization. And you look at some of these models like Hire or even Vinci, the big French infrastructure company, they really are quite radically different. And so again, it can seem immensely daunting. So I think the first thing you have to kind of recognize is that we need revolutionary goals, but it's going to be evolutionary steps. You don't blow up what's there. You don't launch the mother of all change initiatives, right? I mean, it's not going to work. You have to, if you look at the companies that have been down this track, they started with typically a bold ambition of how do we, rekindle the entrepreneurial spirit, or at Roche, how do we remove every barrier to human achievement and become much more patient centric. So you start with a bold goal, but then it is evolutionary steps, right? It's like one experiment, we try this, we see what happens, and then we move to the next. So, for example, Bank of America, large, sprawling empire, talking to their CEO a couple of years ago, they have taken out about half the layers of management. And I said, how did that start? He said it started just by on all of our org charts and our communication. We started to highlight every leader who had less than 4 or 5 direct reports, and we just highlight it. We put them in color. People go like, "What is this?" Oh yeah, well okay. Well, like, why is this? Why does And so simple things that start to draw attention to the problem and make it clear, hey, we need something that's different here. Some companies have done bolder things. I think recently Dell said they want to double the span of control. I don't know how that's working out for them. But I think most of all, it comes down to starting with a new set of principles. You have to ask yourself, what would change? What do we need to change the way we lead, manage, organize, plan, allocate resources, evaluate, assess a contribution? What would need to change if we wanted an organization that was more meritocratic, where it really was the best people, not the people who are most successful at climbing the ladder, whose opinions matter? What would we need to change if we wanted everyone to really feel like they had a stake in this company and was an owner? And that's not having a few percentage points. That's really having the freedom to make decisions and so on. What would we need to do if we wanted an organization that was connected laterally and where we were constantly sharing best practice and creating incentives for people to level up rather than waiting for somebody at the top to tell them, here's your KPIs or here's a new policy? So you start with a set of principles of transparency and community and ownership and meritocracy. And then you say, okay, if we were serious about those principles, if we wanted that to be embedded in our DNA, what do we change? So I'll give you an example. At Hire, they're organized into about 4,000 micro businesses. This is the world's largest appliance maker, and they're in Europe and America and all around the world now. But they divided their company in China up into 4,000 micro businesses, and everyone has a little entrepreneur running that business. Now, I'm not going to get into how they tie all those things together. They have some very sophisticated ways of collaborating and working on big things together. But they wanted every employee to feel like I'm working in something that is mine, that feels the size that I can get my hands around, where I know my voice will matter, my opinion will matter. And one of the somewhat radical things they did there is they give every team the right to hire and fire their own leader. And everyone on the team has the same incentives. They know if they grow faster than the industry, they get a big bonus and so on. And so nobody wants a leader who's merely nice. They want somebody who's effective. And so, is that a bold thing to do? Yes. But can you do it without the sky falling? Yes. Right. Again, when you look at the data, more than half of all employees have changed jobs or companies to escape a bad boss. Well, why do they have to leave your company to do that, right? Maybe make the leaders generally accountable to the lead. And if you have the right incentives and the right process and so on, yes, you can have an organization where employees will recognize this person's not doing a good job. We need somebody else. So,
Yeah.
And you take a sequence of things like that. So at Hire, I could give you 20 little vignettes like that. And pretty soon you have an organization that's very, very different than the one you have. So we could get a little bit more into the mechanics of how you do that. But I would say, what we know about how you change big, complicated things is you change them one experiment at a time, right?
Yeah.
This is how life evolves, right? It evolves one experiment, one mutation at a time. You don't throw out everything and say, let's start again, right? So it's, the trick here for any organization is how do you increase the pace of experiment, right? How do you look at every little unit, every team, as a little laboratory, and give people the encouragement, the tools they need to say, what, maybe there's a different way of assessing people. Let's try this. We'll run this in parallel with the old. We'll see what we learn, and if it works, we'll scale it up. But it's taking the same spirit we use when we think about experimenting with products or websites and so on, and saying, no, we need to be equally experimental about how we lead, manage, organize. And the company that experiments more and finds the new way, those are the companies that are going to win.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just hearing you speak, Gary, I draw many comparisons of when I work with large corporates trying to embed from my market research days, embed customer experience culture from customer, satisfaction, customer loyalty surveys. And it's similar. Okay, you need a clear purpose from the top, foster trust, empowering teams with autonomy. But I think the key is, you can't make these massive changes straight away. So it's important to start small, get the teams, experimenting, learn, and then like you say, you scale on top of what works there. And I think with your Hire example, I know from the book I took a snippet from when you had the conversation with the CEO there, Zhang Rumin, and he said our goal is to let everyone become their own CEO, which I really liked, and again drew comparisons with when I spoke to Rita McGrath. She talks about seeing change, snow melting from the edges. You've got to have those people on the coalface, haven't you, that are able to see what's happening and give them the power to make that change there and then, and feed that back into the organization.
You have to make it easy for them to do that. The one thing I would like people to kind of understand about why we wrote this, the book is not, the primary goal of the book is not to simply say, let's take down bureaucracy. I think that needs to happen. But that is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to build the capabilities that are going to be required as we live in a much more complex, chaotic world. And I probably don't maybe emphasize it enough in the book. But for me, the kind of core thing we're trying to achieve is institutional vitality, corporate vitality.
Yeah.
So we know that in our human lives, vitality is kind of the cornerstone of wellness and human flourishing, and it's a little bit hard to define. But you know it when you have it or when you see it. Somebody's energetic; they can't wait for the new day. They're motivated to go and do new things, and And you see so little of that when you look inside of large organizations. And by the way, we can go into this if you want. There's a lot of data that backs this up. Large organizations are becoming ossified, calcified, fossilized, and we know this, and we can measure it, and we can talk about it. But if you say, okay, so we need organizations that have this kind of ethereal thing called vitality. Well, what does that mean in practice? And for me, it's four things. One, I need an audacity advantage. I need the courage to aim high. As a rule, institutions do not outperform their aspirations. And what happens as institutions grow, the gap between aspirations and resources gets smaller and smaller. And pretty soon, it's good enough simply to keep up with your competitors. So we can come back to that. But without stretch, there is no innovation. So I think you start there. And by the way, in a bureaucracy, ambition is often discouraged. It's seen as being unrealistic, right? The only goals that are credible are ones you can plan for. So if you're Elon Musk and saying, let's see if we can get to Mars, you're going like, what an idiot. Like, where is that? Like, insane, right? So that I think is a first audacity advantage. I think the second for me is a resilience advantage, which is the ability to change as fast or faster than the world around you. And again, we know that often, doesn't happen because almost everything inside large organizations is built to formalize and perpetuate what we're already doing. And the amount of energy and time that goes into creating something different is small. So resilience advantage. Number three is an innovation advantage, because I can't change. I can't have that adaptability unless I have a stream of groundbreaking ideas. And then finally, I need the human advantage at the core of it all. I need people who are passionate and come to work every day wanting to do something new. So these things all kind of hang together, right? Without a really compelling and noble goal, you're unlikely to change as you need to change. If you don't have a steady flow of new ideas, you don't have the fuel for renewal. And if people don't show up excited to do new things, you don't have innovation. So I think to accomplish all of those things, we have to get bureaucracy out of the way. But it's more than that. You also have to build in greater fluidity and resources. You have to, as I said, build in more laterality. You have to build in more aspiration, ambition. So, I don't want people to see this as, hey, well, this is just like a long screed against bureaucracy. Yeah, it is to a degree. But we want to get by that because there's something better on the other side. And I'm pretty sure that the companies that win over the next decade and beyond are going to be the ones that are more ambitious, that can change faster, that are more innovative, that inspire greatness. And right now, we know from data that is not the reality in most organizations.
Yeah, and as you were talking again there, Gary, you talk about this human advantage, and your book discusses this rethinking, traditional HR and incentive systems around their rewards and performance programs. Can you give some insights into how organizations can motivate their people in this new paradigm?
Well, yes, I think, I think number one, you do have to give people meaningful upside. And that doesn't always have to be financial. That could be reputational, but I have to feel that extraordinary contributions will get recognized and celebrated and valued. And you talked about Nucor, there, every employee. So that's number one. Number two is, and I'll come to Nucor. Number two is you actually have to give people the skills they need. You have to train them to think like business people so they know how to make smart decisions. So when you join Nucor, these are what you would call blue collar employees, but they're all trained about the economics of running a steel plant and what that means: labor utilization, cost of capital, energy costs, and so on. And then the teams at Nucor, and in a plant, of 1,000 people roughly, they'll have maybe 30 or so of these teams. Every team is measured on what they're doing to raise capital efficiency, whatever process you have. And when you raise capital efficiency, you get a reward for that in next week's paycheck. It's quite immediate. You improve the business, you get a reward.
Yeah.
And so I think now you can't, and by the way, and then I think freedom is the third component. I believe at Nucor, I'm going to now forget whether it's $50,000 or $75,000, but every frontline employee can make a significant expenditure without asking anybody's permission. In most companies, you can't buy an office chair without getting a sign off, right? It's like, how
Yeah.
insane is that? Um,
Yeah.
so competence, freedom, upside. I think this is what HR needs to be spending their time figuring out, and creating those preconditions, because the competence and the capability is there, but we simply haven't turned it on. And yeah, so and then you start to think about, well, maybe we need to have peer-to-peer assessments on compensation, right? Do you have compensation bands, or should compensation be a function of how much value you create in the eyes of your peers? So we could talk about some other examples there. But it's interesting when you look at performance, the data on how people feel about performance assessment systems, even HR people, a tiny minority thinks it's effective. A tiny minority thinks it motivates employment, or motivates extraordinary contribution. A tiny minority thinks that it's actually fair, that it's identifying the best people. So I think it's a deeply broken system. We're going to have to start over there, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you talk about the fact of, HR, or human resource management, and the fact that there's two words within that, resources and management, that this toxic notion that, resources, we're human beings, we're not just, seen as faceless cogs in the wheel, if you like. And then you've got this, this management piece where they're incapable of thinking and doing things, having that autonomous nature, being able to spend $75,000 if the need be, in Nucor's example. So you're right, it really does need a rethink, doesn't it?
Well, I should add, maybe to the list I was just going through, let me add one more, which is transparency to performance. So at Nucor and at Buurtzorg, the amazing Dutch home health company, the performance of every team is visible to every other team. And so nobody wants to be at the bottom in that league table. And it's a powerful mechanism for, okay, what's going wrong here? Why are we falling down? How do we fix that? And so, I learned that early in my career as a young professor at the London Business School. Maybe for the first term, I thought I reported to the dean or to my department chair. Well, at the end of the first term, all the students give you a grade, and they fill out a form. How did Gary do? Uh, and I realized, and by the way, how I performed and how every other faculty, that's visible across the whole school. There's like, if you're a crappy teacher, like there's no place to hide.
Yeah.
So, if you have that kind of transparency, how much control do you need on people? In fact, I would say, Nick, one of the really interesting questions to ask is, who actually needs managing?
Yeah.
So, if you ask the average person, do you need managing? They look at you kind of quizzically, like, I don't think so. Like, maybe. But I think a human being needs managing for only one or more of three reasons. Number one, if they lack competence, right? If they just don't have, the skills to do what you're asking them to do, then you have to constantly look over their shoulder and make sure they're not screwing up. Well, we can fix that problem pretty much. I think we can. Number two is if they don't have context, if they don't understand how their work fits into the broader thing, and they don't have the inputs they need. Am I doing this? Is this helpful to others? Is it going in the right way? So there's no feedback loop and there's no context. And so a manager can give you that. And then third is if they lack conscientiousness, if they're just kind of lazy and don't want to do a good job. And again, there's ways of fixing those problems that don't involve layering on more managers. So with the right systems around them, if you build competence and with transparency, you can quickly identify people are not being conscientious. And today, you can give people all the information they need around context. It's not clear, and again, I think it's one of the really hard messages in the book. And the reason I think that it's hard for some organizations, maybe even to get started. But I looking forward, I'm pretty sure we need only about a third, maybe, of the number of managers we currently have.
Yeah.
And, you can understand why, that's discomforting. Now, this is not a new thing to say, more now, back in 1980 something. So like 40 years ago, Peter Drucker said that looking forward, he said the average company will have a half the number of layers and a third the number of managers. He saw the same things we were seeing, right? and the same maladies and the same change to a knowledge economy and so on. And he thought this has to happen. Well, it didn't happen. In fact, it went exactly the other way. And maybe we can talk about why. But I think so. It's not that we're making some prediction. I mean, people have been expecting this for a long time, and it hasn't happened. But it does have to happen.
Yeah.
And the good news is most of the people in managerial roles would probably rather be doing something else, right? If being a manager wasn't correlated with prestige and money, if that went to other people, then the attraction of being a manager is a lot less. But in most organizations, if you're in a technical role or some other role, at some point, if you want to keep moving up the ladder, you have to move into a managerial role.
Yeah.
And so if we change that, I think the incentives for people going into management changes. And and it's not that much fun being a surrogate parent to adults in a large organization, which a lot of what management is. So it'll be a difficult transition. Some will not make it, but I think many will be quite relieved. Like, hey, there's another route that values my competence. It's not just values my administrative ability, but it's a hard thing to kind of face up to at hire. They redeployed 12,000 middle managers. Those jobs will never come back.
Yeah.
And most of them are now working in their micro enterprises. They're probably making more money. They're certainly having more fun. And you have to be willing to face it. That may need to happen.
Yeah. What would you say to listeners who might be sitting there listening, Gary, and saying, well, that's all well and good, Gary, if you're a CEO or within management, you can make the change. But when I don't own it, how can I make a change? What would you say to that question?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of learned helplessness in most organizations. And so people just kind of believe that there's nothing they can do to push back or change things. And I in the book, I try to challenge that. In fact, in many ways, the last third of the book or so basically tries to answer this question: how do you change the system when you don't own the system and nobody asked you to change it?
Yeah.
Because, to be blunt, if you wait for the people who are running the bureaucratic model to upend it, you may wait a very, very long time, right? I mean, so I think wherever you are, you have to, if you see a problem, if you see, hey, I see a lack of trust in my organization, or I see the fact that innovators have a really, really hard time, getting funding, or if I see that we're spending an inordinate amount of time on work that adds no value, that's kind of been handed down to us, you have to find a way of experimenting within your unit of a different way of doing this. Let me give an example. I think this is in the book. I can't remember. But this was in fairly large global company, and one team, about 90 people, I think it was an e-commerce team. They saw that there were a lot of new ideas in the team potentially, but it was hard for them to get any money because budgets were allocated top down. Once the budget was done, there was very little slack in that, and it was just kind of hard to carve out something. So they ran a little experiment. In this particular unit, the person who led that unit was able to find $9,000, $150 times 60. Am I getting this right? Times 60 people. I think that's 9,000. And he said the following. He said, we're going to give everybody $150 to invest in any idea that they think might be interesting. They didn't have some fancy, idea platform. They just literally took a blank piece of wall and they created a little template and said, if you have an idea for something we should be doing that we're not, tell us what the idea is. How would you test it? What do we think of the results? Why do you think it's a good idea? Post that there. And then over 30 days, other people could post comments and say, what do you mean by this? And so on. Then you could repost again. So super simple. And at the end of 30 days, all the employees were able to spend their $150 wherever they thought. And I can't remember how many ideas, but about half of them got funded, and they were like really great ideas. Well, that simple experiment was enough to provide data that convinced like CFO, CTO that we should actually set aside a portion of our budgets to fund new ideas. And so rather than, and I almost guarantee if that person had started by going to senior leaders and saying, we need something like internal Kickstarter, right? And, probably, maybe like a couple of $1 million a year would be good, given like you're going to make no traction at all. So, don't whine, go hack the system, get some real data, and then come and say, hey, this might be a better way. So there's several examples like that in the book of small experiments that you can run locally. In fact, we even have, how do you get your colleagues together for half a day and think about what those experiments might be, right? So there's plenty of advice on that. But I think, all of us have, you have a choice. You can whine or be resigned, or you can say, how do I start to change something?
Yeah.
And here's the interesting thing. Just about every CEO knows this is a problem, right? And in fact, as you know, many organizations over the last few years have been under pressure from activist investors. And when you read the critique of these investors offer of their target companies, it's just a critique of bureaucracy. You have too many layers, you miss these opportunities, you're too slow, and whatever. And so CEOs are under enormous pressure, and you may get a little resistance when you push back and you try something new. You want to be careful not to blow up what's already there. But most CEOs are super eager to hear what you've done. Like, oh, that's really interesting. Didn't think about that. So it's not like you're always pushing against a closed door here.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think how you talked there as well about individuals versus, to make the change. Again, I can't remember whether it's in the book but it came up that when I was doing some research, Harvard professor Marshall Gans, he says people who change the world are focused not on winning the game, but changing the rules. And some of those examples that you've talked about there, it's about taking ownership of this and just doing this and seeing if
and then getting your peers involved, because the other thing I've learned is in any organization, if it's one person trying to move an idea up the chain of command, it is very easy to say no to that idea. And in fact, most ideas are stupid, so maybe no is the best default answer. I don't know, but it's very easy to say no. Having said that, when you have a group of people who've worked together, who've run an experiment, who've tried something, and they go kind of en masse, a dozen or 2 dozen or more, it's very hard to say no, because this is not one person's kind of brain fart. This is something that maybe is real. So my advice to people inside of organizations who are trying to get something to change is, do not start by asking permission. Do not start by going up even to your direct super. Start by seeing if you have some peers who care about this thing and are willing to spend a Saturday kind of prototyping or thinking through, or collecting data, collecting evidence, and so on. But go sideways before you go up, for sure. And of course, when we do this kind of work at scale, we use a platform where we can have thousands of people working together on, if we took these new principles seriously, meritocracy, transparency, so on, what would we change? And what's interesting there, Nick, is, when you have a few hundred people or 1,000 people who've all said, yeah, that's a really amazing idea, right? You've peer reviewed that. That's really we should try that. Or conversely, that's a really stupid thing we're doing over there. It is super, super hard for some entrenched interest to say, no, we're not going to do that.
Totally
And
agree.
So you have to find ways to aggregate the influence of the pro-change constituency, so they have more influence than the people who might want to protect the status quo. That, and I'm not arguing for revolution. I maybe a peaceful one, but it's not anarchy, it's not terrorism, right? But what you have to begin to think about is, how do you find and activate the people who really love the company, really love the organization, want it to do better, are invested in it, and listen to those people, right? And today, technology allows us to bring those voices together very, very quickly, to do the peer review, to get the best ideas to the surface, and not let great ideas be hammered or suborned by a few senior leaders who are uncomfortable by that.
Yeah, yeah. There is so much in this book. And it's an expanded book, so there is so much in there. So I mean, I do recommend, of course, that listeners go and buy this book, Gary. And so I've got so many more questions, but just to get to the finishing questions that I ask all my guests. Well, my last guest was Damien Hughes. He's a change psychologist, co-host of the High Performance podcast, and best-selling author of 9 books. And his latest book is called Micro Habits: tiny changes that supercharge high performance. So when I spoke to Damien, I told him you were coming on the show. And so he said, right, well, here's a question that you need to ask Gary. And his question was, in an age where everything can be measured, what is the measurement that really matters?
I don't know if there's one measurement that matters above all else, but if there is, and we have a set of measurements, we created a vitality index and a bureaucratic mass index, but I think that the measure above all else is engagement. Are people excited and enthusiastic to come to work? I mean, that is absolutely the canary in the coal mine, and I'll expand on it just a moment because it's very important. I go into a lot of companies and they talk about their internal surveys, their employee attitude surveys, and so on. And all of them tell me like we have 85% engagement. And then I talked to Jim Clifton, the chairman of Gallup, and he says the average is like 20% around the world. And in Europe, like the average is like 11% or something. And I'm going like, okay. So I asked Jim, I said, like, why this mismatch? And it's very important. So they have I think, a very credible, with more data than anybody else in the world on engagement. And there's a set of questions that you end up on a 5-point scale. And he said all of the engagement, the real engagement, happens between 4.5 and 5 on that scale. So if you're getting 4.2 and you think you have 70-80% engaged, you do not. Engagement is at the very end of that, which is where you see companies that really have figured out how to turn people on. So for me, if I could only look at one thing as a CEO, that's what I would look at, because I know if I get that right, profits follow, turnover goes down, customer care goes up. There's a lot of other things we have to measure. But if I'm the CEO, that probably I would start there. And that would be my number one priority, is how do I move us into the top decile or the top, 5% of companies around the world. And so, yeah, that would be my one.
No, I agree that. Well, and having spent a lifetime designing surveys, carrying out surveys, we could get into the whole, scales, and that's why I prefer a 10-point scale, because that 5-point scale is a bit too narrow.
Sure. I'm not pitching that particular
No,
metric.
no, not at all.
And there may be better ways of measuring that, but that is, but Gallup does a good job, and I think that is,
yeah, sure.
That is where I would start.
So the next couple of questions just from listeners. Firstly, is from Brad Williams. He's based in New York, and he asks, how do you see the role of middle management evolving as companies transition from bureaucratic to human-centric models? Maybe we've answered that already, but...
Well, I think we're still going to need people who play connecting roles in organizations. I think we will have some level of hierarchy. We will definitely still have some staff specialists and so on. So I think there's going to be a role there. But I think in general, the role of being, quotes, a manager today really needs to shift to being a mentor, to being a coach, to being somebody who builds the capability of other people, rather than I'm the one who runs this little piece of the empire. So, you have to shift from being kind of task focused, I would say, to being relationship focused, from being simply managing in the present to kind of thinking 6, 9, 12 months out. Where does this part of the business need to go? How do I help it get there? But, so those are, I think, the right way to think about this. But don't expect that job to exist in the same way it does today.
Yeah. And as Elizabeth Brown, she's from Durham here in England, where I'm speaking to you from. What role does technology play in enabling human-centric organizations, and are there any risks involved?
So I think technology can be absolutely catalytic here, and I've thought that for a long time. It's the reason, for example, going back now 20 or so years, we started using technology, collaborative technology, to drive large-scale change, because I could just see how it would find the voices on the periphery and give them more power, and you could build coalitions and get the best ideas to the top. But very few companies have used technology in this way. Here we are on the threshold of a whole new technological revolution with robotics and agentic AI and generative AI and so on. But when you look at history, mostly we've used those technologies to pave the cow path, to just do more or less what we're doing, to save some white collar labor costs or to do something else. We haven't used it to rethink the way we lead, manage, and organize. So, for example, I've done a lot of open strategy projects, again, using technology where we can bring thousands of people together to collectively kind of identify the future and where we need to go next as an organization. It is not that hard to do. I have friends who've written a whole book about this on open strategy. I'd highly recommend that. And yet the number of companies that have used, technology that already exists in this way is vanishingly small. Partly I think because leaders don't want to give up their monopoly on like setting vision, setting strategy. That's why they get paid all the money. And so the moment you say, as some leaders have, hey, we need everybody on to thinking about this. We do not have enough bandwidth. We don't have enough sensory capacity as the world is changing. We need all of our minds to be thinking about this. You know, but most companies have not done such a simple thing. I wrote in The Future of Management now almost 20 years ago. I asked, why doesn't every company have a leader meter? We have enough data now, and with AI, you can certainly do this. If I start to look at Slack conversations, all the project software that I can interrogate, all the emails, and so on, I can very quickly find out who is actually do people see as a leader in this organization, who's future focused, who is influential, and so on. And every employee should have a score that indexes their demonstrated leadership capacity. It's not that hard to do. Hasn't been done yet, right? Resource allocation. Some companies have experimented with kind of this Kickstarter idea at scale, because resources tend to get allocated in patterns over time, and the people who control the existing businesses control those conversations. And so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we overinvest in the past at the expense of the future. We can solve that problem. We can open that process up. Technology allows us to do this. Mostly hasn't been done. So I think, technology is a powerful enabler, but you got to get it focused on the right problems. And so far, we haven't used it in the ways I think we could to radically change the way we manage our organizations. But I think it will come because it has to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, over your career, you've given out lots of business advice, but what's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given, Gary?
That's a very, very good question. I suppose it didn't come as a piece of business advice, but I turned it into that advice. When I was doing my PhD, one of who became a very good colleague, C.K. Prahalad, who's now sadly passed away, but great management thinker, he was on my dissertation committee. And he said, Gary, when you write the dissertation, I want you to write the literature review last. And I thought that's kind of weird because normally you go out, you survey all the literature, and then you write that. And he said, the reason is I want you to do something original. I do not want you to start. If you spend a year reading what everybody else has written, at some point, make sure what you're doing is new, but work on that first and then go test it, right? And, I thought that was great advice because if there's one human capacity that's more valuable than ever, I think, is the ability to be a contrarian.
Yeah.
And particularly with AI, it is literally impossible today, and I've said this for a few decades, it's literally impossible today to know more than the next person. The data is there for everybody. Now, maybe some really deep technical knowledge, yes, but even there, I can get access to that, right? If I'm smart enough to understand it. So there's very little economic value in knowing more, but there's a lot of economic value in knowing different. So the ability to, as you're sitting in a conversation, to say, what is not being talked about here? What are we all willingly ignoring? What are the assumptions that are taken for granted here? What are the principles and paradigms and other points of view that have not been, to be able to do that in every setting and then have something unexpected to contribute, that is the secret to creating value. And so that was probably the most useful piece of advice I ever got, was learn to think like a contrarian, not simply to be ornery and oppositional, but to identify the things that we're not talking about, that are not part of the conversation, that are maybe even uncomfortable, and bringing those things to the fore.
Well, thank God he did say that, because hence all the great books and articles and that contrarian thinking that you've come up with. So you definitely are one of the world's greatest business thinkers, Gary.
Kind of you to say.
Who would you like me to reach out and invite to come on this podcast in the future? Who would you like to hear?
I have to think about that. It would definitely be useful if you can get Bill Anderson, who is leading this turnaround at Bayer and led the turnaround at Roche. He's a fantastic and deep thinker about all of these things. I don't know if you've had Jos de Blok, who is the founder of Birdzorg, one of the most radically managed healthcare organizations in the world.
No, I
Uh,
haven't.
16,000 employees and no managers at all. That would be a great. I think your listeners would find that very, very interesting. Um, yeah, I would look for the people who are running and leading really like radically different sorts of organizations and see
Yeah.
what we that's I just went out and said who are those people, and they're very, very willing to share. And it's we need most of us need at least some sense that something is possible before we're going to start down that course. And so when you see organizations that have kind of challenged the bureaucratic orthodoxy and lived to tell the tale, those are the people I would kind of want to learn from.
Well, I'll definitely reach out to those two because, as you say, it's. I mean, there's lots of examples in your book, but those two in particular, I'll reach out to.
Another chap who you might find very interesting, Kevin Nolan runs GE Appliance, and they are the American side of Haier. Haier bought GE Appliance from the General Electric company, and they've applied the Haier principles there. Just an extraordinary story of what had been quite a moribund business, just now running on all cylinders and leading every other competitor in their market. So that's a great story too, and I'm sure Kevin would be willing to talk.
Yeah, I will. I'll definitely reach out to Kevin too. Gary, finally, my next guest is Marcus Collins. He's got one foot in the world of practice. He's a strategist, one foot in the world of scholarship. He's also a professor in Michigan. And I'll be talking to him about his latest book, For the Culture. What question would you like to leave for Marcus?
Um, I would be interested in knowing from his research what organizations he believes have the healthiest cultures in the world and why.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I'd love to know that answer too.
yeah, 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 and why. So
Yeah.
yeah, if I was sitting down, I would start with that question and then go from there.
Well, I think it will have come through crystal clear, I'm sure, to the listener today that bureaucracy, which we've talked, that's been the core of our conversation, is stifles initiative. We need to start to build environments that nurture curiosity, learning, psychological safety. This shift to humanocracy does require radical change in individuals, in teams, in processes. But if we look to build organizations that are collections of people, not machines, we need to remember that, then the future will certainly be a lot brighter and we'll free this human spirit from this disabling bureaucracy. So definitely go out and buy the book, listeners. But if they're interested in anything else, Gary, where's best to point them towards in terms of if they want to contact you?
I occasionally put stuff up on LinkedIn, so please come find me on LinkedIn. Love to connect with you there. And if you have a question or something you want to ask me, I do try to respond to anybody who reaches out there. Website is garyhamel.com. And occasionally I'm on X, but LinkedIn is probably the best way if you just want to connect and ask a question, something like that. But you can find contact details on my website as well.
Well, Gary, it's been a privilege just to spend an hour in your company. I've loved all your books. This latest book, it's a fantastic book, and hopefully with this conversation, then we can start to instill some change in some of these huge corporate structures. So, thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
So these are my key learnings. I think the first key takeaway needs to be that the management model is broken and that bureaucratic control, predictability, and conformity stifles innovation, responsiveness, and at the end of the day, employee engagement. Gary mentioned quite a few stats from Gallup. It's no secret that all CEOs know as well that bureaucracy is a problem with hierarchical structures slowing us down. But the question is, how do we make the change? And Gary's book, Humanocracy, tells us how, by empowering employees, fostering a culture of experimentation, and removing unnecessary controls that cost the US economy alone $3 trillion in lost productivity, then we can make this happen. Gary talked about, instead of relying solely on financial incentives or top-down goals, organizations should create environments where intrinsic motivation flourishes. This includes purpose-driven work, opportunities for mastery, autonomy, meaningful contribution. And he talked about various examples, including Nucor and Hire, implementing a model where small teams took ownership of their P&L, but also the hiring process for new team members. He also talked about recognition and development programs being important to support personal growth, and leaders should definitely foster a culture where experimentation and learning from failure are celebrated. And finally, he talked about, to change an organization, first you need to change yourself. You need to think like a hacker, and don't think this is somebody else's problem. Take the initiative. He said, think contrarian, think differently. So you build your hack so that it solves a problem and the obstacles that you're currently facing in your company. But he did make the important point that you then need to get credibility and courage to bring other colleagues along that journey with you to influence change as you take it up the hierarchy. This is a huge topic, a vitally important one for the future. And so I do fully recommend that you go and buy the book. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time on the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast with Marcus Collins.